In the last video, I got the panel lines, chipping, and initial rust tones done. Now I need to tighten up some of the details on this Gladiator. I'm pretty happy with how the Gladiator's looking so far, but there's a lot of little details that I want to get sorted out and get ready for the rest of the weathering, because what's going to be coming next, the bulk of the weathering that's going to be coming next is going to be earth effects, dirt and streaking and things like that. And I want to make sure to get all the details painted so that they can receive that extra amount of earth effect weathering also. I had not painted things like this roll here and the exhausts and some of the other features, because I knew that this larger chipping and panel lining, which tends to be kind of what I call a big event, meaning it's broad brush strokes that do that generally. I needed those things to wait until I could be a little more precise. So now that everything's at that point, I'll get to work on tightening things up so that we can move on to the earth effects weathering. And you may remember that in a previous episode I painted this and mentioned that I was purely painting it this color for the sake of the YouTube thumbnail. I just needed it to be a color that had a little bit of contrast. I knew this was not the color I wanted to paint it, but I hadn't decided what actual color I wanted to paint it. So I'm going to paint it something slightly different. I finally decided on this Death World Forest from Citadel, and I decided to use this because as I looked at this color, it just really reminded me of the faded army blankets that I used when I was in the army. There was these very common wool blankets that the army put on beds and things like that. And generally when they were new, they were much darker. But when they were faded, they got closer to this color. And so I thought that would be a good one to start off as the base. So I've just thinned this with just a little bit of water. And what I'm going to do is go in and just rough paint this like that. And you see the paint's fairly thin, but I want it to go on in some smooth coats. So I'll paint this on, let it dry, and then go back and repaint it again. One thing to note is the paint that I originally painted this with was a glossier color. I didn't think about that at the time. So this paint, the first coat is not really gripping real well, but that's okay. It's beating up just a little bit, but that's okay, because once I get this on here, it's going to matte that surface down, and the next coat will grip much, much better. Next, I'm going to use this Castellan green, and I'm just going to paint that into the lower areas, the shadow areas, just to darken them up a bit. I'm not even going to worry too much about blending or anything like that at this point. I just want some of the lower areas darkened, and any of the major folds I want to add a little bit there to suggest more shadow. And then also what I want to do is just very carefully right along the edge of these areas that are tied down, things like that. I want to just gently feather in some right there to really deepen those shadows. I'm going to be putting a wash over that, but I want this slightly darker green to kind of make that stand out even more, just to give this section a little more depth. I mean, it's already obviously 3D and got a lot of depth, but that'll just sell the notion a little more. I'm going to use Vallejo leather brown, and I'm going to paint in all of these straps that have buckles. For these areas right here that appear to be some kind of rope or something like that, I'm going to use deck tan. I'll have to paint this part off camera. I simply can't. I can't see it to paint it. I've got to get in so close with my, as I mentioned on a few other videos, I have very poor eyesight, and I'm going to need to get in right up close, have this right up to my face. So you'll just have to trust me when I say I'm going to paint this with the deck tan. All right, the base colors are done. Next up, I'm going to start doing some shading. I forgot to paint these buckles, so I'm going to paint them with Vallejo Basalt Gray. All right, now that I've got all the base colors in place, I'm going to go in and add some Agrax Earthshade into all these recesses around the straps and the various folds and things like that. That's going to bring out, well, it's going to deepen the shadows of the recessed areas, and it's going to bring out those details a little more. Now the next step is going to be to bring in some highlights. So what I did was I put some of this Death World Forest in my palette, and then I put a little puddle of it near the near the Death World Forest, but not in it, of this Morghast bone, because it's got some yellow in it, but it's also a desaturated yellow. So that's because this is a desaturated color, it will lighten it, but it won't brighten it, because I don't want it to be a lot brighter. And then I just kind of gradually put in dabs of this Morghast bone into this until I got a lighter color of this. Then I thinned it down, and what I'm going to do next is start a process where I'm just going to use a little bit of paint, and I've got most of it off the brush. I worked off most of it onto a paper towel, and you see that it's just leaving just a little bit of paint. And I'm going to start pulling from the lower areas up to the higher areas, and it's going to deposit more paint up at the top of the stroke, and that's what I want, because that's going to lighten that up. And if I get a little more there than I want, I can go back to a paper towel, unload my brush, and just get up any that's pooling up there. But what I'll do is I'll do this in several passes, each time starting a little further up, and what that's going to do is it's going to build it up in a gradient fashion to a lighter color, and it's just going to make the top of it seem a little lighter than the lower parts of it, and that's going to give it more a look of depth. It's going to help bring out the folds and the creases and things like that. I'm going to go back to my deck tan and just touch in some highlights on the highest raised areas of these little ropes. Now I'm going to highlight these leather straps. I just used the original chocolate brown that I had painted them with, and then just lightened that up with a little bit of deck tan. I'm just going to paint the upper surfaces with that lighter color, and then when that dries, I'll add a little more deck tan to the mix and paint one more round of highlights on just the very center of those highest surfaces along there. All right, I think I'll call that done. And if you're wondering why I spent so much time demonstrating painting this and painting this, it's because it's fun. I mean, it's simple as that. It's great fun to take an element like that and give it a little life, and just go through that process. So don't miss out on the journey when you're building your models. Okay, the next thing I'm going to work on is this exhaust thing that goes right here. So I want to make that look really rusted and worn. Now I base painted this in a 1-to-1 mix of Leadbelcher and Vallejo's Sky Gray. I really like this mix for metallic looking things that you want to not be too shiny. It has a little bit of a metallic glint to it, but it has a slightly aged look to it. So I think it's a good foundation for this effect. All right, I'm going to start with this Lifecolor Rust Dark Shadow, and I'm going to base all of the areas that are going to have rust on them, most of them, 99 and 44 100%. I'm going to base those in this color, and then I'm going to progressively stipple on the rest of the set, the Rust base color, the Light Shadow 1 and the Light Shadow 2, and get a rusty look. I'm going to focus the rust where I think the heat would be, coming out of the exhaust and through this pipe here. This thing, I don't know what it is, but it's something that I'm going to assume is somewhat shielded from the heat. So I'm going to rust it heavier down here where the thing enters, where the heat, the exhaust will be entering, and I'm going to rust it heavier down here where the exhaust would be exiting. In the middle of it, I'm going to allow more of what's going to end up being the OD coat over it to show. Hopefully it'll look good. That's the plan. All right, you can see how that rust looks there, and I think it looks like rust. I really like these Lifecolor paints, this rust set. It's a very good set, although there's lots of others on the market. There's two side pipes that go along the side of the model, and I did those at the same time. That silverish part right here, I'm going to imagine this part, if I can get it twisted around, this part right here, I'm going to imagine that's made of a material that does not rust, and I'm going to be painting that slightly different color. Next, I'm going to use this USA Olive Drab, and I'm going to sponge this on because I want it to have a slightly different pattern. And I'm going to be a little heavier towards the middle here to kind of build that up. I still want some of the rust to show through, and I want some of that silver underneath to show through. But I'm just going to slowly build this up along that middle area, and then every now and then touch off on one of the other areas like that. And I'll have to reload my sponge, which I'm doing now off camera. I'll have to reload my sponge a couple of times to build up the coverage that I want. Now I'll bring out some of the detail with this Agrax Earthshade, especially back here on this pipe thing that has some texture to it. Not texture, has those raised edges. I'm just going to use this Agrax Earthshade to kind of bring those out, give it a little more depth, and then I'm going to just put some right there. But I'm not going to worry about if it's not too neat, as you will see why in just a moment. Now I'm going to sponge on some Agrax Earthshade on the other end of it, just to make it look a little more worn and beat up. And notice that I'm focusing on mostly the rusted areas here. I'm not focusing on that olive drab area. I want to do some fuel staining right here. I'm imagining that to be a fuel filler cap, but I just can't get past not having it painted red. I don't know why, but I always feel like fuel filler caps need to be red. I know they're not, but in my mind, those and those big round handles, circular valve type handles, got to be red too. So let me paint this red before I get started. That first color I used was Vallejo Gory red from their game color range. This is flat red, and I'm just going to use it to paint these little raised up details here. Alright, after a quick blast with the hairdryer, I'm going to put some Nuln oil around it to start bringing out the shape. I'm going to use another Citadel shade called Reikland Fleshshade. It's kind of a reddish shade, and I just thinned it down with water. And what I want to do is I just want to provide a little bit of a background of fuel having spilled out when it was filled up. Now I use some Agrax Earthshade right out of the pot to just paint in a more distinct fuel leak. This is a fresher fuel leak, if you'll I guess you can think of it that way. And I'm going to use some of this Vallejo brown engine soot. It's kind of a thick, pasty-like stuff. And I've thinned it with just a little bit of Agrax Earthshade to thin it up and darken it down. I'm just going to put that down here to represent where kind of sludge and dirt and grime and stuff would collect, where the fuel stain is at its terminal point. You figure there'd be more fuel that would end up down there. So I'll just put that in like that. And before it dries, I'll just add a little water to kind of blend that edge in. All right, and there it is. Now, most people are never going to look close enough at that to see that there's several things going on there, but it's little details like that that spread across the whole model in a very consistent fashion really contribute to the depth of finish that, when somebody looks at the overall big picture, seems to be much more realistic. The brain registers that that's there in some way, even if they don't consciously see it, because it all looks like stuff that should be there. And, the brain goes, okay, this looks real. So I think, taking those little extra steps are worth doing. Now, there are a few places that I want to, I guess you'd say, boost the rust that I put on there in the previous video. So I'm going to go back to my wilder orange rust effect. Sean Connery modeling. But I'm going to go back to that orange rust effect, and I'm going to add it in just a few places, not all of the bolts, not everywhere that I had put rust before, but just a few. And what I'll do is use those as opportunities to just do some rust streaking in a few places. This is an enamel product, so I've got a fairly decent working time with it. All right, I think I'm ready to put on this side pipe. What I did was I just painted this piece here with USA Olive Drab, lightened that up with a little bit of Iraqi sand, did just a little bit of chipping on it. I'm imagining this being a non-ferrous material, meaning it's not made of ferrets. That's why it won't rust. And then I sponged on some of the USA Olive Drab and the chipping color for that. Just sponge some of that on there, imagining that originally this was painted solid olive drab, but because of the heat, it's just been burning away the paint and things like that. Now, first I'll drop in some Tamiya extra thin cement in these holes, and then I will attempt to get these lined up, and then I will push them in place. Yeah, I can live with that. That'll work. Now, at this point, I could put the exhaust in place, because it's painted and ready to go. However, unlike these, this might get in the way of trying to do some streaking effects, which are going to be in the next video. So I'm going to leave this off for now, and then I'll be able to do the streaking effects under it, then put this on over them, and then continue some streaking effects once it's in place. I just realized a very small but important detail I forgot to paint. That. This little clear piece, I've got some masking fluid on it, and I'll remove that further along in the build. But I'd forgotten that I just snapped it on, and I need to paint this little thing up under here, whatever it is. I'm going to pretend like it's some kind of light, but need to get that painted. I'm going to start by just basing that whole area in there with neutral gray from Vallejo. I'm going to use this Warhead metallic blue from Ammo MiG. It's a really bright, punchy blue that retains its metallic properties. When you paint it on, it stays shiny really nicely. So I'm going to put that on there. All right, I'll pop that back on there. And then when I'm ready to clean the mask off, I'll just touch a little glue to it, get it cleaned off, and hopefully it'll look okay. All right, these two tanks go underneath the bottom of the model. I painted them with some Vallejo sky gray just to represent the exterior color. Now I'm going to go in with some neutral gray, and I'm just going to heavily chip around here, especially along the bottom, because I'm imagining that because they're pretty close to the ground, that they might get some stuff thrown up against them, or if it jumps from one thing to another, that maybe they get a strike that way. But I'll just do some chipping like this on it with this neutral gray. All right, now I'm just going to thin down just a little bit of these Lifecolor rust paints and sponge those on, kind of like I did for the other exhaust, just some random sponging to give it kind of a rusted look. All right, I painted these mechanical parts with Vallejo black gray, and I'll just go back once everything's dry and give it a localized dry brush of sky gray just to make those details pop out a little bit, and then I'll plug it onto the bottom of the model. And in the next video is when I'll start adding weathering effects, splatters and mud and stuff like that that'll cover up most of this stuff. All right, well, I think I'm going to call this video done. It was all about tightening up little details, getting this painted up, the exhausts, this thingy that goes under the bottom, adding into the rust stains, just a few little details that once they're painted, it sets the stage for the final earth weathering effects, the mud, the streaks, the rain marks, all of that stuff, because of course that's going to go on the top of everything else. So that'll be in the next episode, which will be the final episode in this series. Well, thank you so much for watching this video, especially if you're still watching at this point. I'm grateful for those who hang around till the very end. It's always encouraging to know that you do. This is really a fun model. It's not easy to get. If you can't find it, it's kind of expensive, I will admit that. But it is definitely a fun model that I think is worth the time to build. I'm really enjoying it. So if you're looking for something different and you don't mind spending a little extra money on it, I would highly recommend this kit. Well, if you've not already done so, there is a subscribe link down over here. So please click on that and subscribe and hit the little bell icon that will tell you when I have new videos out. And if you would be so kind as to leave a like on this video and just drop a comment down below, that helps me grow the channel, which is something I'm trying to do. I would be most grateful for that. There is a link down below to Patreon if you would like to support this channel, or you can click the join button right over here and join right here on YouTube to help support the work that I do. And for those of you who are already supporting me, whether it's on YouTube or on Patreon, thank you so much. It is a blessing to my family and I, and it allows me to do the work that I do at the pace that I do with the materials and equipment and things like that I wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So thank you very much. And finally, as I always like to do, I'll leave you with one final thought. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.